Hello, and while I'm not perfectly on time, I think actually I guess I'm an hour late. But you know what? It's 105 PST Pacific Standard Time. My name is Michael Salati, and we're gonna get started with web dev on web dev. Now, I'm a developer program engineer at Google, and one of the things that I do is I work on a website called web.dev. So what you see over here is I actually have web.dev up, and it's pretty much like your one-stop shop for everything related to working on as a web developer. So we have content that you can learn more, so you can explore these structured learning paths that we have, which cover topics such as improving your load times, building progressive web apps, improving the performance of your React and Angular applications, and more. We have a measure tool which you can actually run your website against. So over here, we actually have web dev run through the measure tool, where it provides feedback and scoring on areas where you can do better. So, for example, we have our performance is set to 85. And if we check the performance area down here, when it gives a breakdown as to why we got that scoring, it mentions that, oh, we could defer off-screen images, and that's maybe a reason why our site might be slow. And if I click on the guide that it references, it actually takes us to content that exists in the Learn section. So pretty much the things that we're putting out there are actual things that you can act upon, and we're providing guidance on how to act upon that. And we have a blog where we're hosting articles and great content on a slew of different areas that don't necessarily fit a learning path, but still are probably going to be useful to you as a web developer. So today there's one issue we want to take a look at and fix on web dev. So to find the issue, we're just going to hit up the web dev GitHub page. And that's right, WebDev is a open source project that you can contribute to. The URL is github.com/Google Chrome/web.dev. So we'll let that load in. And we go to our issues section. I don't remember the exact number for the issue, but actually, hold on. I believe it is 2386. All right, so let's see what comes up. Okay. So here we go. Here's the issue. And it is specifically to create a was this helpful widget. So it looks like what we're looking to do is on the bottom of certain pages, we'd like to ask users of web.dev if, to give a feedback on if the content was actually helpful. So they have an example of what that content would look like. It's just a kind of radio box form with yeses and nos if it was helpful, if it helped you complete your goals, does it have the information you need, is the page information accurate, and whether it was easy to read or not. And this actually looks an awful lot like the sort of feedback forms that you'll see on developers.google.com. So if I go to developers.google.com, and we'll go to the web section, and here we can click into this article, load instantly. I believe when you get towards the bottom of the article, it asks, was this page helpful? So this is the same idea for the sort of feedback. I say yes, and then it's the same sort of questions that we saw before. So we're looking to implement something like this on web dev, and hopefully it's going to look a little bit nicer. It's going to look more like this. So let's get started with working on this. So let's make this a little bit bigger so you guys can see. And we are going to jump into the project. So that is Documents Workspace web.dev. I'm going to pull down to see if there's any changes. Nope, no changes. What branch am I in? Git branch. Cool. So let's open up the code in Visual Studio Code. Here we go. All right, so this is a project, and for web.dev, we use a static site generator called 11D. So we pretty much develop all of the components and content that you see on web.dev ahead of time, and display that as like static HTML. That way we don't need JavaScript or any framework in order for the site to actually load or work, because if we were to dependent on JavaScript, like that presents a small issue where some users might not actually be able to see the content on the website if they have JavaScript disabled. So we have everything work with pretty much everything work with JavaScript turned off, and that's how we're gonna get started and get going from there. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're just gonna create this little feedback form with no JavaScript, just pure HTML. So let's look at how that gets done. So the is this content helpful? It's going to exist on the bottom of most pages. So here we have this optimize largest contentful paint, and as you scroll down all the way towards the bottom of the page, we're going to want the is this helpful to appear somewhere around here. And this shouldn't be too difficult, because every page, even though we most of the site is generated static HTML, it's generated. It goes through a process, and it gets processed and goes through a build process specifically that allows us to kind of use templates or components or partial stuff that we can mix and match together to build out this fully fleshed HTML page. So let's see where in our code does this stuff come into. I'm gonna jump to the top of this page. I'm gonna inspect it. And so everything gets pumped into this content area. So there's div ID content. So somewhere in our code base we have content, and that's where our stuff is going to get pumped into. So let's see if we can find that. ID equals content. Okay, so here inside of our layout, there's div ID equals content, and so the content gets pumped into here. But there's somewhere more specific I want to jump into. So I think it is, so this is a template, a nunchuck template that we have that generates some of the HTML. And you see here we have like the nav bar with the measure, blog, about section. But here we have content, which is not a fully written HTML, but it's just a placeholder or a space that we can pump information into. So I think specifically for the posts, it also uses a nunchuck file called posts. So here is posts. It includes partials post. So we'll go into the partials folder here, and here is another post. And here is pretty much the page that every post goes through. There is a hero image here. So this is the code that generates the hero image, which here's what you see there. We have breadcrumbs here. This is a component, and this dynamically on the server during the build process generates these breadcrumbs here. Signposts, we have the author. So this is a component that generates the author stuff that we see here. And then we get to the actual content somewhere. So where is that? Here's the content, which we see inside of here. And so what we want is at the very bottom of this page to actually display that content. So somewhere around here, probably under last updated, we want the content to, the was this helpful to actually appear. So is there a last updated and improve article? So probably right about here is where we want that to go. So I'm just going to create a div to see if I can, if I'm targeting the right area. Div, and we'll just put a h2 tag, and I guess the h2 tag will just ask for the user to give feedback, and we'll eventually flesh this out with the actual give feedback form we want to build. And next thing I should actually do is npm run dev is build the page, or build a web.dev on my local environment, because right now I'm just navigating to the deployed site. So we can do this locally and see how that looks. Almost ready. Okay, all the pages are built. Let's give this a actually, let's change it from web.dev to localhost port 8080. All right, so here's the page running on my local environment or my local computer. If I scroll down to the very bottom of this post or page, I should see, here we go, we have this give feedback. So we're able to have the actual, we're able to add this give feedback to one post, but if we go into the blog section, click on a different article, like here, why you need cross-origin isolated for powerful features. If I scroll down to the bottom, give feedback is here as well. If I go to a learn section, let's click into fast load times. Let's click into the article, why does speed matter? Scroll to the bottom, give feedback is here as well. So by adding this H2 and give feedback inside of this partials post nunchuck file, it will now exist on pretty much every single post, but that's it. It's not going to bleed into other places. So we're able to code it once and apply it in a bunch of different places. So that is some progress. Next thing we're going to want to do is actually create the form for users to submit feedback. So let's create a form element. Let me just make this a little bit bigger for you to see. Let's create a form. And something I don't like to do too often is to kind of give the form, you know what, we'll hold off on that. But let's create the questions that we want. So let's create a div. And we're going to have a div for each question for the time being. P tag. Was this page helpful? And then we're going to create some radio boxes so a user can type in if, or click to say if it was helpful or not. So type equals radio, type equals radio. We'll give it a name. And the reason why we're giving it a name is when we end up looking for it or looking for the element or getting the results for it, the name will kind of give us that key value pair. So the name is going to be the key of the form submission and the values if it whether it's been selected or not. Another reason for this is because we can have multiple radio buttons. We only want a user to click one radio button at a time. That's kind of the point of a radio input, is that they can only select one radio input for the question, as opposed to a checkbox where you can select multiple checkboxes for a question. So I believe by giving it a name, a specific name, it'll tell the other radio boxes that only one of these radio boxes that has this name can actually be activated at a time. So for this question, we'll do page helpful. And we'll set the value to be yes, that the page was helpful. Close that. And we'll have an input that says no, that the page was not helpful. And I'm actually just going to copy and paste this into the other divs real quick. So oops, that was not right. Paste that there. And you know what? Easier way to do this is, there we go. So was this page helpful is a question we want to ask. What was the other ones? Did this page help you complete your goals? Okay. Did this page help you complete your goals? We'll call this met goals. Does this page have the information you needed? Does this page have the information you needed? guess we can call this needed info. Is the page's information accurate? Is the page's information accurate? Accurate info. And I believe there was one more after is the page's information accurate. It's was this page easy to read? So let's create a was this page easy to read? Was this page easy to read? And the name will be readable. Let's save that and let that rebuild. Okay, so let's check this out. So if I give the page a refresh, so we have give feedback, was this page helpful? We can click, and I want to inspect these elements real quick. So here we have our two inputs. Here we have our two inputs, and they both have the attribute name set to page helpful. And so that kind of lets the inputs or the radio buttons know that they're related to each other. So as I click one or the other, only one of them stays selected at a time. And that's because they're kind of siblings, or they belong to each other. They're related to each other, and only one sibling can be active at a time. But they know they're siblings because we set the attribute name to be the same value. Let's say if I was to hypothetically change the no value from page helpful to page helpful 2. Now I believe the relationship should be between them doesn't no longer exist. So if I click either of them, they can both stay active at a time, which we don't want that. We only want one of them to be able to be active at a time. So that's why we set the name to be equal to the same value. So that way they're related to each other. And this now is a basic form where we're able to click and select the stuff that we want. Next thing I guess we need here is just a submit button. Just so it could look like a form to submit. So I'm just going to do another little div, which is going to be a holder for the submit button. And we'll just create a button. Type is going to be set to submit. And so this will, by giving it the attribute type set to submit, this button will now actually submit the form. This is going to end up turning into a problem real quick, but for the time being, I think that's fine. So, and we'll see what happens there once it's built, and we'll build a fix for that, or a temporary fix for that. All right, so let's give it a refresh. So now we have our submit button, and what you'll see is when I click it, the page is just going to refresh. And this has a lot to do with how forms in HTML work. And let's actually just check form behavior. Pretty much the form is trying to submit itself once I click submit, but I'm not really giving it any direction on how to handle the submission. Typically, forms have some behaviors to it. So here I'm on MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network, to look at some of the information about forms. And so there's an action and method, which are the attributes that are relevant to why my submit is acting all wonky. But here, if I look at what the action does, it's the URL that processes the form submission. This value can be overridden by a form action attribute on a button, etc. And then the other one, which was method, it says the HTTP method to submit the form with. So there's post, get, and dialog. But the problem is because these are how forms natively work. So form is inherently able to submit itself without you needing to necessarily write any JavaScript to handle that. It's trying to handle it itself, but we're not really doing anything with that. We're not telling it where to send this information to or how to send the information. So we're not using the action and giving it a URL to post to, and we're not giving it a method post telling it like, hey, post the information to here. So what we're going to do is that we're going to write some JavaScript in order to handle that for us. And we're actually going to do this with a custom element. Ideally, I want the form to be rendered using pure HTML for the time being, but I want to write a handler that will address when a user actually clicks submit. And we'll write the handler with JavaScript. So I'm going to scroll up in the code, and we are going to jump into this folder called lib components. And I'm actually just going to copy a component. I'll just duplicate this copy code component. There we go. I'm going to paste that, and I'm going to rename the folder because the component for it is going to be feedback. So this is going to be the component that's going to handle the JavaScript side of handling the feedback. Style won't matter for the time being. We won't handle the style in here, so let's delete that. And so the only thing we want is the actual code. So we will change it from copy code to feedback because that's where we're going to handle feedback. There's a lot of stuff in here that exists from the copy code. So we're going to remove all of that. And we're going to do custom elements define. So this allows this line custom elements define allows us to communicate with the browser to say, hey, we're going to define a new custom element, like a div tag or a p tag. The first argument is the tag name. So we're going to call this web feedback. So now if you write like open bracket web feedback close bracket and then add the closing tag, now whatever we design this element to do or how it's going to behave, it's just going to be attached to the DOM. And the second argument is the class that we're going to pass in. So now we're saying, okay, if the browser uses this tag web feedback, this is the class we actually want to use for it. And so I'm going to take this tag name and I am going to wrap the give feedback stuff inside of it. So web feedback. Let's close it. Okay, so now we have our web feedback element. And so when the browser reads this tag web feedback, it's going to understand that this is the component we want to load in, just because we're going into the custom element registry and we're adding it as a custom element that can be used. There's just one more place I need to include it, because even though I built the custom element, it's not really being included into the build process of the website. So I'm just going to go into app.js, which is where we kind of load in some of the custom elements that get used on the website. And I'm going to add feedback here. So that way it actually gets registered on to the browser when we build the site. And so that is building. We'll give this a second and I'll actually be able to show you guys what that looks like. So here we have the feedback element, and I'm just going to do a console log. Hi there. So ideally, when the web feedback element is used inside of the browser or used inside of the DOM, we should see into the log, it's going to console hi there. And that's just because we call it inside of the post. So let's go to a page like why does speed matter? We give the page a refresh. And right over here, we have our hi there that comes from the custom element for web feedback. But if we go to a page where web feedback doesn't exist, it's not going to log. So if I go to the home page, there is no web feedback area. So there is no hi there other than, so this is the first hi there. And if I scroll down, there is no other hi there. But if I go back to the page, why speed matters, our hi there is going to get logged again. But it's a little bit of a mess to read through all these things. There we go. Here's our hi there again. So this is how we know that the custom element is actually getting registered. But we still come into the same issue that if I click submit, the page kind of just refreshes because I'm not really giving it any direction on what to do when a user submits the form. So we're going to write a handler for that, a way that we can catch when a user submits the form and do something with that. So we're going to use one of the lifecycle hooks for a custom element, and that's called connected callback. So anything we write inside of this connected callback function or method is only going to be executed once the feedback element has actually been attached to the DOM. Not when it's constructed, but when it's actually attached. And what we're going to do is we're going to look inside of the custom element. So we can do this, and we can write a query selector, and it's going to look for things inside of it. And because we have our form inside of the custom element, we could do this query selector, and we can just search for a form element. So we'll call this dot form equals to this query selector form. And we can write an event listener for it. So this form dot add event listener submit. So now when a user submits the form, we can catch that submission and do something with it. So the argument for the callback is, we'll just call it E for the event. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do E event prevent default, which is going to stop the form from doing its natural behavior. In this case, it's to submit it with whatever information is provided on the HTML side of things. We're not providing it a URL. We're not providing it a method of posting the form. So we're just going to prevent all that behavior, and this should actually prevent that refresh. So let's save that. It's going to quickly rebuild. All right, let's give the page a refresh. And now if I click submit, it should stay right where it is. Nothing should really happen. Submit, and that's it. Nothing happened. We hijacked the form submission event using JavaScript here. But what I do want to do is to actually get the values from the form. So we have a bunch of different questions that we're asking, like if it was helpful, if it helped the user complete their goals. So let's try to get those values. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a form object, and we're going to do that from new form data. What new form data allows us to do is pass in the form object. So we'll go to our event target. That's the actual form itself. And the form data allows us to extract the values for the form. So it's going to go through the form element. It's going to look through all the inputs. So like we have the met goal, we have the page helpful. These are our inputs, and it's going to extract the value for that. And we can do something with that information later. But here's our form. Let's actually create a little object in order to do this. So the form data object that we have isn't really anything we can manipulate or use. So we're going to want to convert this into an object we can more easily use. So we have our results, and now we can take our form object, we can get the entries, and we can, let's turn this into an array. And we can call a for each function. So form entries is going to return an iterable with the key and the value for each input. We turn this into an array just because it'll be easier to iterate over, And so now we have pretty much an array of tuples of key value pairs. So entry, and so into our results, we can create a field, which is going to be the key, so entry 0, and assign the value to whatever the value is here for the entry, which is the second argument of the tuple. Let's console log this result object. And this will give you a better look as to what the form this submit event listener is actually doing. So not only are we going to log it, I'm going to console clear the console so we can remove all the excess noise before we log it. Okay, so let's give this a refresh. And so we can pick if the page was helpful, it didn't help us complete our goals, didn't have the information we needed, and we'll just click submit. The console gets cleared, and unfortunately I am not seeing anything here, which means I probably, remove that. There we go, had to remove the filter. Here we go. So console was cleared, so I removed all the excess noise, and now here is the object of the submission after we parsed it. So for met goals, we can see that we didn't help meet the user's goals. We didn't provide the information needed, but the page was helpful, which kind of matches everything we see here. So this is starting to look better. It's starting to look like what we want, but this is only in behavior. It doesn't aesthetically actually look like what we want it to look like. And so we can hopefully fix that, and we're probably gonna do this using a little bit of HTML. We can do this more in the HTML and CSS side of things. So let's go back to the code. Let's go back to the form that we have here, and we'll start to write some of this stuff in just some HTML. I think that might be the way to go. So the H2 for the give feedback, that should stay the same. I think for structuring the actual questions and the radio inputs, instead of just doing divs, which ended up looking like this, we could probably use a table to structure it to look this way. I believe earlier we had a engineer tinker with what this would look like, and here's a sample. Here, let's click this to see what this will look like. Here we go, so let's inspect. I believe they ended up using a table to structure it. So here's our table. So we'll end up doing the same sort of thing to structure this, and I think that'll look a little bit nicer than me just trying to wing it using divs and a lot of stuff like that. So let's use a table like they did. So inside of our form, we will create a table. Close the table. First thing we need to do is give the table our header, and the header is where we're gonna place the yes no kind of labels for the rest of these questions. So thead tr for our row. And th, and this is where the actual content is. So we can do this looking back here with it looks like it's effectively a three columns, right? The first column is the actual question, second column is the radio button for yes, and the third column is the radio button for no. So for the labels up here, or the header, we'll have three columns. The first column will be empty, the second column will say yes, and the third column will say no. So this one will stay empty, this one will say yes, and this one will say no. And so now we can start working on the actual body, or where the questions are going to exist. So T body. We need our table row. All right, first one we'll use th here, and we'll move what's this page helpful into here. What's this page helpful? And then we can actually have our little radio buttons. So we'll do TD, TD. We'll move the input into here. And here is going to be our no input. And so what we can do is we can just copy and paste this a couple of times and update the values for each question. So there's 5 questions total, I think. How many are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 5 questions. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Next question is, does this page help you meet your goals? Does this page help you meet your goals? Met goals. Met goals. Does this page have the information you needed? Does this page have the information you needed? And let's grab the name value, which we decided to go with needed info. Needed info. Is this page's information accurate? Is this page's information accurate? And we will grab the accurate info name and use it here as well. And finally, was this page easy to read? And that value is readable. So save all that, and we can remove all these old inputs and stuff like that. All right, let's save that and see how that looks. Give the page a refresh. Wait, might not have finished building yet. Okay, there we go. Now we give the page a refresh. And now we're actually starting to look more along the lines of what the form is actually supposed to look like. So let's go back for a second to the screenshot, just so we can work inside of the issue. Put that side by side. Like this. Minimize this. Get rid of that. All right, so now this is starting to look more like here. We have all of our questions, our yeses, our nos. Give feedback. Let's keep working at this. So one thing we have here is this all fields optional. I'm just gonna add that, and we can do that hopefully fairly quick. So inside of the form, we'll place this here. Small all fields optional. Nope, I spelled optional correctly. Make that small. And another thing is the submit button actually has a little style and aesthetic to it. And this style that we see here and this style from the give feedback actually comes from some CSS classes that already exist on web.dev. So I'm just going to use those CSS class names. I believe for our H2, the class I want to use, the CSS class I want to use is w detail header. And for the submit button, the classes that I'm going to want to use, I believe this is multiple classes, is there's a W button, and just to make sure that the button is that bluish color, W button primary, which is just a modifier to give it some color. And one other small thing I'm going to do is inside of our div, I'm going to give it a class called W text center, and what that's going to do is it's going to just center the button inside of the div it's in. I know the original design doesn't necessarily call for it, but I kind of don't like it shifted to the left. That's just a personal thing. Whether that's the right thing or not is yet to be determined. So we'll save that, and what we should end up seeing is our this form should start to look more like this. So we'll give this a second. Specifically, the things that should look a little different is this give feedback should look like that, and this submit button should look like the submit button over here. Did it finish? Yeah, finish. Okay. Refresh. There we go. Almost there. So give feedback. Not quite the color that I expected, but the submit button looks as it is supposed to. Did I mistype the name of the H2 tag? W detail header. I think it's details. So save that. Next thing I want to actually do here, though, is I would love for this to be a actual drop down. So that I can click this and have it open and close. So instead of just always showing it, the give feedback is there, and then when a user decides to give feedback by clicking it, we'll actually show the give feedback question. So this could be done using JavaScript. We could use JavaScript and like have a click event that when a user clicks a button, we show hide the rest of the questions, as well as have the toggle, that little chevron up arrow, go from up to down. But we could also do that with CSS. And by doing that with CSS, we'll actually prevent the need of JavaScript needing to work for some of this stuff. So I am going to attempt to do this with CSS. So let's attempt to do this with CSS. And first thing we're going to do is we're going to use an input. The input is going to kind of house the state as to whether or not we're going to be showing or hiding the form underneath it. So we'll give this an ID, and we'll call it W feedback dropdown. We'll eventually end up giving it some more detail, but we'll use this ID to actually style it. It's going to be of type set to a checkbox, so we can have this like Boolean on/off value. To give feedback, we're going to turn this into a label. The reason why we're going to wrap this in a label, is that the label could be a label for this input. So if a user clicks give feedback or clicks the label, it'll trigger the checkbox that we see over here. So this label is going to be for the checkbox that we see above. There we go. And just to get more granular with some of the CSS we're going to have to write, I'm going to give this form a class name, and I'm going to call the class w-feedback form. Save that for the time being, and we'll see how that looks in a sec. Okay. Yep, let's give the page a refresh. So we have give feedback, color has been selected, we have our checkbox here. And I don't know if you guys notice, now there's this chevron here. And if I click the chevron, or if I click anywhere in this line where give feedback is, this checkbox's state will toggle. So on, off, on, off. This styling for the H2 that includes the chevron actually comes from the class wFeedback, label I believe it comes from wrapping it in the label and putting it in respects to a checkbox input. So there's a CSS selector, I believe, that looks for a label that is next to an input checkbox. And I believe that's how some of this styling comes in. So let's inspect the element. Here is our label. Let's go to the computed values for the label. It's in the computed, or it's in the styles. It's in the H2. There's something specific that adds that. There's something specific to the styling on web.dev that adds that, but I'm not exactly sure where that is. Okay, so there's a rendered fonts, there's a material icon. So there's something about the wrap and that relationship that adds that, but that's existing web.dev CSS. I'm not too concerned with how that works, so long as it does work. But what we want to do is that when this state is on, all of this should appear, and when this state is off, none of this should appear. So let's work on that next, and we can do that with, just like I said, just some pure CSS. So let's create a CSS file where we could work on this. Let's minimize a bunch of this stuff. So we're in the site folder, styles. We have some generic style. We have component specific styles. So we're gonna create a component. So we're gonna work inside of a component, and we'll call that feedback, a CSS. So what is the styling for the feedback going to actually look like? Let's actually open this so it sits side by side with the code so we can adjust it as needed. So what we want is that little okay. So what we want is the we want this input field for the dropdown to be hidden. We don't necessarily want to show that. And we'll be a little bit more hyper specific that if the dropdown is of the type checkbox, we want this to be hidden. So we'll set display to none. What else can we do here to improve the way it looks? Next thing we want to do, another thing we want to set to not display is the actual form content unless the checkbox is enabled. So here we're going to start to write some conditions. So if there is a if there's this element with an ID of feedback dropdown, which we have over here, feedback dropdown, we are going to take a sibling element to it, which is going to be something that has the W feedback form, and we're going to set the display equal to none. But we'll have a condition that if the checkbox is actually checked, then the sibling element of the feedback form, we will set the display to be block display. So we'll save that, let the CSS recompile, and we just need to import the feedback CSS so it's included inside of the build process. Feedback. Okay. Finished. So give this page a refresh. That checkbox no longer appears. And now as the state should toggle, here we go, nothing is happening. So not necessarily a good sign, but it's a step in a direction. Let's go back to the feedback and see what's going on. Let's remove some of the complexity here. So just if something has the ID of feedback dropdown, display none. So this input has the ID of dropdown none. Let's remove this type checkbox here. Let's remove this type checkbox here, just because it should only be applied to a checkbox. And I'm wondering if specificity is looking for the next element rather. I'm wondering if it's looking for the next element or the sibling directly adjacent to it. So let's move the label with the H2 above the input. That way the input and the form are like exactly adjacent to each other. And let's save that. And let's see if that improves the look and behavior that we're looking for. Okay, let's give the page a refresh. Okay, so right now it is hidden. I click it, it shows. I click it, it hides. So this is much more along the lines of what we were looking for. So now we can show and hide the submission. The only problem that we have though is this give feedback. Ideally, what I'd love is to see the that chevron to rotate. So we're gonna have to do a little bit of work in order to do that. I am actually going to, for the time being, I'm gonna move the label back underneath it. I'm gonna give it a class, and I'm gonna say W feedback label. Save that. So now we're gonna improve our little specificity in our display and hide to. So here we go. So it's gonna find an element with the ID feedback dropdown. It's going to also ensure that it has a sibling, an immediate sibling called feedback label. And then after feedback label, there should be a sibling called feedback form. And the styling that we write underneath it should be applied to the element that's feedback form. And so something I did check a little bit ahead of time. Here we go. So we have W details checked. Okay. So we have W details. If it's checked, it goes to W details header and it rotates the chevron inside of it. W details checked. So let's use the CSS for W details here. So instead of the ID dropdown, so here, W feedback dropdown. So now we have a condition that if inside of here, and you know what? Just copy this. Save that. So now we're creating a new condition that if W feedback is checked, it's going to find a element inside of it called details header, and it's going to take the after, which is where we have that little chevron, and it's going to rotate it. So that's way the chevron will go from down to up. And we'll use that, and I think that should work. So let's give the page a refresh. So right now this is pointing down. Click it to open. So it didn't rotate up, but this is a step in the direction we want to go, I think. So that's working as expected. So why isn't this rotating as expected? We have an element with details header. Transform. Let's inspect it. There's a very real possibility that the CSS should be applied, but it's not because of because the CSS is being overwritten somewhere. All right, let's see. So it is open. This H2 with details header should be rotated. Let's see inside. Here's our after element. It doesn't look like the rotation's actually been applied to h2 w details header after. We have w details header after. It just looks like that wasn't applied, the transform. I'm gonna give that a save, let that rebuild real quick, and then we can give it another look to see if that works as expected. Expand. No, it's not actually being applied. This is interesting. Why isn't this being applied? So here's the after the first time. It has a material font icon to it, which is what we expect it to see. And the icon is the rotation. So I'm wondering if the issue with what I'm doing has to do with this input. W feedback dropdown checked. Okay, I think I see what the issue is. So it is looking for an element inside of the input. So here, if I hover over the selector, you can see that when ID feedback dropdown is checked, it's looking for a sub element to it, which is the W details header. But going back here, W details header isn't inside of the input checkbox. It is inside of the label for that input checkbox. So what we can do is similar here, where we have the plus W feedback label. So it's skipping over siblings. Let's add the skip over sibling here, W feedback label. If I hover over it, now the CSS is going to ensure that the W feedback dropdown is checked. Then it's going to the sibling with the class W feedback label, and then it's going inside of it to an element with the W detail header, and it's going to affect the after, which is the little material icon that we have. So let's save that. Let's flip back here, give it a refresh. So if I click it, it rotates up, points down, but this is giving us our give feedback form with this little up and down. And now if I end up clicking some of these fields and submit the form, we log the details of the form here. So this is actually great headway. The only thing that we really want to do is to style these radio boxes so they look more like material icon radio boxes, or material styled radio boxes, rather than these generic icons. So we can do that, and I actually have some of that pre-written, just because it can be a little bit of a nuisance. But I'm gonna copy. I want to copy something real quick. So we're gonna need reference to colors here. Okay. So for our checkbox, here is some code for it. So we're going to give the radio boxes this class called wRadio. It removes pretty much all of the appearance for it. It removes the border, it removes almost everything from it, but it gives it a background. And this background is a SVG image of a material radio box. I converted it already ahead of time to base 64. And if that's something like, I can show you guys how to do that in a second. So it's just going to have a background of this. So I can go to all of our radio boxes, or our radio inputs. Let's just select them in the nunchuck file, which is just our HTML template for it. And I can give all of them the class wRadio. So by default, they're going to have this look of being an unchecked material radio input. And when the radio input gets checked, we're going to just change the background to the image of a checked input. And so this is just another base 64 image, or base 64 SVG image. So let's save that, and we're going to go back and see how that ends up looking. Okay, give the page a refresh. So we'll expand our give feedback. So now these are actually the base64 images for these radio boxes. If I inspect the input, you can see that the background is applied here. If I remove the background, they disappear. So when a user selects them, they're checked. So the radio buttons have a checked modifier, so it swaps the background. And so now we have definitely a better looking radio box here. And so this is kind of the base work of what we want for this give feedback form to look like. There's definitely like more steps or additional things that could be done for it, but I'd say this is a great place to start and to work from. This code will eventually be in GitHub probably later today. So if you go to github.com/Google Chrome web.dev, and if you check out issue 2386, the creator was this page Helpful Widget. Probably later on today, there's going to be a pull request over here. There's linked pull request. There's going to be a pull request link to this, which is going to be the code that's been written today. Just got to do a little bit of polish, and then I can push this up and open up a pull request. Anyway, I hope you guys found this video insightful or helpful as to how we actually build the web.dev website at Google. I will be streaming these live coding sessions every Tuesday and Thursday at about 1 p.m. usually, 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And then Saturdays, I will be uploading videos in regards to different areas of like computer science or just web development. Not live streams, just more polished videos. So last week, I actually released a video in regards to algorithm design and analysis, and specifically in implementing a insertion sort algorithm using JavaScript. So until next time, I hope you guys have a great day, and can't wait to see you guys Thursday.